Hello, everyone. Excuse me if I sound a bit hoarse. I have the flu, of all things. It seems rather quaint and old-fashioned compared to COVID, but I'm pretty sure it's the flu. And I was waiting to get over the flu before I did this video, but it's day 4 and it's not going anywhere as bad as ever. So I thought I'd go ahead and do the lesson, and a bit of a NyQuil brain fog too. So if I'm not making sense, then I apologize in advance. I'm going to start today with a reading from Luke chapter 13, verses 31 through 35. At that time, some Pharisees approached Jesus and said, "Go, get away from here, because Herod wants to kill you." Jesus said to them, "Go, tell that fox, look, I'm throwing out demons and healing people today and tomorrow, and on the 3rd day I will complete my work. However, it's necessary for me to travel today, tomorrow, and the next day, because it's impossible for a prophet to be killed outside of Jerusalem. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those who were sent to you. How often I have wanted to gather your people, just as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings. But you didn't want that. Look, your house is abandoned. I tell you, you won't see me until the time comes when you say, 'Blessings on the one who comes in the Lord's name.'" So what's going on here? So some Pharisees warned Jesus to leave and not go on to Jerusalem because Herod wanted to kill him. And Jesus responds with this lament. He recalls the violent treatment that the rulers of Jerusalem had given to prophets sent by God to guide the people back into faithful observance of God's laws. And Jesus expresses his yearning to protect God's children, right? So likening he talks about his love. He talks about the love of a mother hen who wants to gather her brood under her wing. He says that's what he's doing. Now the Pharisees have some strong reasons to warn Jesus, because they knew well Herod's ruthless ways and reactions to anyone who challenged him. So they had a good reason to be concerned for Jesus. But despite the warnings from the Pharisees, Jesus stands firm. And he's known for casting out demons and healing the sick, but he will finish his work, he says, saying, "I have a reputation for doing things that I threaten to establish order, but I'm not going to stop my ministry, even if Herod, the fox, threatens my life." So he wanted to protect his people no matter what, right? And we believe that the way Jesus lived, shows us what God is like and what God wants. And so basically God wants to protect his people, and Jesus wanted to protect his people. Think of all the times that Jesus tried to shelter or protect people from being hurt. There's so many instances of that, of course, right? So today, we're going to, in honor of Women's History Month, we're going to talk about an incredibly strong and influential woman who played an important role in the early 1900s. She's probably not someone you've heard about before, but she is a wonderful example of someone who protected her people, just as Jesus did many times throughout the course of his life. So the woman we're going to talk about, her name is Zitkala-Sa. And before I get into her story, she was a Native American woman, born in 1876, so a long time ago, 150 years or so ago. But I want to give you a little bit of background first on the Native Americans in the United States at that time. So there are over 574 legally recognized Native American tribes in the United States. And prior to European contact, there were over 1,000 tribes, bands or clans, but sadly, most of them were completely extinguished as a result of disease, epidemics, or war. During the time of Zitkala-Sa's life, there was a push for Native people to be assimilated as a form of survival. And this is a policy that was popularly known as Americanization, or people would say, "Kill the Indian, save the man." And this assimilation, it was trying to make the Native Americans more European And some of these actions and policies, we know now they were sort of forms of forced assimilation. So it was a way for the people of the time to erase the culture and communities of the Native Americans. And by sort of assimilating them and getting the children and making them forget, just teaching them to be more European, it was a way of wiping out an entire culture. All right, so Zitkala-Sa, her story. She was born with the name of Gertrude Simmons Bonin in 1876 on the Yankton Reservation in South Dakota. And she later renamed herself to Zitkala-Sa, which means red bird in the Lakota language. She spent her early childhood on the reservation with her mother, who was of Sioux Dakota heritage. And there's not much known about her father, who was an Anglo-American. When Zitkala-Sa was 8 years old, missionaries from the White Manual Labor Institute in Indiana came to the Yankton Reservation to recruit children to their boarding schools. Zitkala-Sa's older brother had recently returned from such a school, and her mother was hesitant to send her daughter away. Zitkala-Sa, however, was eager to go. She wanted to go learn. For children who had never been off the reservation, the school sounded like a magical place. The missionaries told stories about riding trains and picking red apples in large fields. So after debating the decision, Zitkala-Sa's mother agreed to let her go. She didn't want her daughter to leave and didn't trust the white strangers, but she feared that the Dakota way of life was ending. There was no schools in the reservations, and she wanted her daughter to have an education. So she saw this as the only way her daughter could get educated. According to Zitkala-Sa's autobiography, as soon as she boarded the train, she regretted begging her mother to let her go. She was about to spend years away from everything that she knew, and she was still very young. She didn't even know a single English word, and tribal languages were banned at the schools. She would be forced to give up her Dakota culture for an American culture. Now, Zitkala-Sa's arrival at school was very traumatic. As soon as they got there, the children learned that everyone would get a haircut. But in Dakota culture, the only people who got haircuts were cowards who had been captured by the enemy. So this was a horrible thing for them. Zitkala-Sa resisted a haircut by hiding in an empty room. When the staff of the school found her underneath the bed, they dragged her out, tied her to a chair, and cut off her braids as she was crying out. Later in life, she wrote that the staff at the school didn't care about her feelings at all, and she said they treated the children like they were just animals and had no respect for them. After a few years at the school granted Zitkala-Sa permission to visit her mother. During the visit, her mother encouraged her to just abandon the school and just stay home and not go back. But she later wrote that visiting home made her sad, Zitkala-Sa did. She returned to the school, and like many children, she may have felt that she no longer belonged on the reservation because she had been at the school long enough that it had changed her. In 1895, Zitkala-Sa graduated and joined a teacher training program at Earlham College, also in Indiana. And she was one of the few Indigenous students. And then she transferred to the New England Conservatory of Music, where she studied the violin, which I think is really cool as a musician myself. And by 1900, she was teaching music and speech at the Carlisle Indian School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, one of the most famous boarding schools in the country. So she was doing pretty well for herself. She worked there for just a couple years. Once she was there, the experience reminded her of her own traumatic and disturbing education. And she watched a new generation of children arrive on trains and have their hair brutally cut. And she began to question why the school required the children to give up their hair and their entire culture just so they could get an education. And she saw the staff would treat the children really cruelly. And she learned that the government paid the school for every child successfully removed from a reservation. And this is when she began to realize that these schools, they were designed to totally erase her people's culture. So she channeled her frustration into a love for writing. She wrote about her personal experiences and customs and values that she learned from her mother. Soon her essays and stories were being published in national magazines. And in 1901, she published a compilation of her work in a book called Old Indian Legends. So that same year, Zitkala-Sa left the school where she was teaching and returned to South Dakota, where she was from. She took a job at the United States Bureau of Indian Affairs, which provided for her financially, and she continued her true passion of writing stories that promoted Dakota culture and values. While working there, that's where she met her soon-to-be husband, Raymond Bonin, and they were married in 1902, and they had a son. They moved to Utah, and Zitkala-Sa worked there as a teacher. But she didn't teach at a boarding school this time, but at a school on a Ute reservation where children lived at home with their families. And while teaching there, she met someone called a man named William Hanson. He was a music professor. And with his help, Zitkala-Sa was able to combine her love of music and writing. She did this by writing an opera called The Sundance. It was an opera that was based on her essays about her Native American culture. It was the first published opera written by a person indigenous to North America. Because many indigenous customs were passed down orally through music, Zitkala-Sa believed it was a really powerful way to share her family's values and to reach a new audience by using this tradition from her culture of oral, passing things down orally into music. She was able to pass her traditions on through this opera and also reach a new audience of people who didn't know anything about the indigenous culture. Now, by 1916, Zitkala-Sa and her husband wanted to be more active in their fight for the rights of indigenous people. So they moved to Washington, D.C., where she worked for the Society of American Indians and the American Indian Magazine. And they soon founded the National Council of American Indians. And she also organized and led other committees and initiatives. But eventually her relationship with the United States Bureau of Indian Affairs became a little bit challenging because she fought to preserve indigenous culture. But she thought that the Bureau did the exact opposite and that they were going to destroy it. Her efforts raised public awareness about the many issues related to indigenous people, including education, economics, employment, health, religion, and she had a direct impact on government policy. The various organizations that she worked with helped pass something called the Indian Citizenship Act in 1924 and an Indian Reorganization Act in 1934. And these were laws that helped indigenous people become secure American citizenship, but also to regain control of their own lives, which the federal government previously had taken over. So by these laws, they could take back their lives and still live their own culture and not be assimilated. Zitkala-Sa died in Washington, D.C. in 1938. But throughout her life, she actively opposed the Americanization of indigenous culture. And all of her writing continued to have an impact on policymakers long after her death. So I just think I was so interested to learn about this woman who I had never heard of before. And I'll share some photos of her as well in the Facebook post. And she was a remarkable woman. I sort of really liked she was a writer and a musician. So those are two things that both really appealed to me. She just, and her writing, it had an impact, right? She was able to have laws, and writing and all her other work, she was able to change laws that for the betterment of the Native American culture and to help people preserve that culture. And she wrote the first indigenous opera, which I think is really cool. And I'm gonna plan to look it up and see if I can find it and find the music for pieces of it or something, because I think I'd love to see it, what it's all about. So there's a quote from her in her autobiography. She says, "I seem to be in eternal unrest. I hate this tug of war of being wild or becoming civilized. I am what I am. I owe no apologies to God or men." I love that. I am what I am. I owe no apologies to God or men. I think that's a wonderful way to end this, because I think everyone feels that way. but especially someone who had been so mistreated in many ways in her life. And now she uses these words, wild and civilized, and she does put them in quotations in her autobiography, because how do you think society defined those words at the time? Basically, civilized was meant how we in this American European culture act, and wild was anything else. Anything else that was different or not how they acted. So very narrowly defined in what these words meant. And they were trying to pull her one way and she felt tugged this other way. So let me just read that one more time. I seem to be in eternal unrest. I hate this tug of war of being wild or becoming civilized. I am what I am. I know, owe no apologies to God or to men. So that's it for this lesson. I'm going to continue on the theme of women's history throughout March, and so for the next lesson as well. So have a great week, and I will see you then.